Instructions. U.S. History. Presidential Profile, John F. Kennedy. On November 22, 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was shot to death as he was driven through Dallas, Texas. He was barely past his first 1,000 days in office. Kennedy was the youngest man elected to be president. He was the youngest to die. Naval officer, author, senator. Kennedy was born into an Irish Catholic family in Brookline, Massachusetts, on May 29, 1917. His parents were Joseph and Rose Kennedy. After graduating from Harvard, Kennedy entered the Navy. During World War II, Kennedy's patrol boat was sunk by a Japanese destroyer ship. Kennedy was seriously hurt in the attack. Nevertheless, he led those who had survived through dangerous waters to safety. After the war, Kennedy was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was a Democratic congressman. In 1953, Kennedy advanced to become a senator of his home state. He married Jacqueline Bouvier on September 12, 1953. They had a daughter, Caroline, a son, John Jr., and another son, Patrick, who died soon after birth. In 1955, Kennedy took time off from the Senate. He needed to heal from an operation meant to ease his back pain. During that year, Kennedy wrote a book titled Profiles in Courage. In his book, Kennedy wrote about 8 senators who had shown great courage and decision-making abilities during hard times in the past. His book won the Pulitzer Prize for History. Following through on presidential promises, Kennedy almost became the Democratic pick for vice president for the 1956 election. 4 years later, he was chosen by his party to run for president. Millions watched the television debates between Kennedy and his Republican challenger, Richard Nixon. After a narrow win in the 1960 election, John F. Kennedy became America's first Roman Catholic president. Newly elected, Kennedy delivered his inaugural address, his first speech as president. He spoke about what he intended to achieve as the nation's leader. One of his most famous lines from the speech is, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy worked to follow through on the promises he made during the race. During his time in office, President Kennedy dedicated America to spreading human rights around the world. He established the Peace Corps, an organization that sends American volunteers to work in poor countries. He also formed the Alliance for Progress, a program to help Latin American countries. These 2 far-reaching aid programs brought a spirit of American hope, justice, and purpose to the relief of developing nations. But relations with world's other superpower, the Soviet Union, were still dangerously tense. This long period of tension was known as the Cold War. Bay of Pigs failure. Shortly after his inauguration, Kennedy permitted a group of Cuban exiles to invade their homeland. They were attempting to overthrow Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba. Castro was a communist and was close with the Soviet Union. The mission, called the Bay of Pigs invasion, failed. Castro remained in power. Soon afterward, the Soviet Union cracked down on West Berlin. After World War II, the German city of Berlin was divided. The Soviets controlled East Berlin and all of surrounding East Germany. West Berlin was like an island that survived with the support of West Germany and its allies. Kennedy replied to the Soviet actions by strengthening the U.S. military. He poured money into NASA and set aggressive goals for U.S. space exploration. The Soviet Union then constructed the Berlin Wall, but relaxed its pressure in Central Europe. Nuclear arms agreement. The calm did not last. In October, American Air Force spy planes made a discovery. The Soviets had secretly installed nuclear missiles, the most powerful type of weapon, in Cuba. Kennedy cut off all weapons bound for Cuba by placing U.S. naval ships around the island nation. While the world trembled on the brink of nuclear war, Kennedy held secret talks with the Soviets. He persuaded them to take the missiles out. In exchange, the United States agreed not to invade Cuba. Kennedy declared that both sides had important reasons for stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. He called for a slowdown in the development of new arms. This led to a treaty between the two world superpowers in 1963. They agreed to stop testing nuclear weapons in the air, in space and underwater. Kennedy championed civil rights. Meanwhile, in the United States, segregation meant blacks were treated unequally and restricted from many places and services. After years of debate, Kennedy called on Congress to pass a civil rights bill in 1963. The bill would require hotels, restaurants, and other public places to serve people of all races. Kennedy's vision also included improving the role of the arts and culture in the United States. Jacqueline Kennedy sought to make the White House a world-class museum. She saved countless architectural treasures from being torn down. She also improved the appearance of Pennsylvania Avenue, the street that connects the White House and the U.S. Capitol. Mourned by the world. In November 1963, Kennedy was assassinated and the world mourned with the United States. More than 50 years later, Americans remember his charm and style, his courage and intelligence. Above all, Americans remember Kennedy's gifts as a leader, of which the entire nation had been so suddenly robbed. Adapted.
Question 1. Which section highlights the idea that President Kennedy and his wife had a positive effect on arts and culture in America? Naval officer, author, senator, following through on presidential promises, Kennedy champions civil rights, mourned by the world. Question 2. Which of the following choices would best describe President Kennedy's reaction to segregation? He encouraged the practice as a way for business owners to protect themselves. He never fully decided whether the practice should be legal or not in the United States. He wrote a bill that restricted the practice to just southern states. He called on Congress to pass a bill that would end the practice completely. Question 3. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. JFK. How is this quote relevant to what is going on today? Make sure that your answer is in complete sentences. This should be one to two complete sentences. Question 4. Above all, Americans remember Kennedy's gifts as a leader, of which the entire nation had been so suddenly robbed. Based on the quote above from the article, what do you think was Kennedy's most important contribution to America, or accomplishment, during his time in office? Use evidence from the article to support your response. This should be 3 to 4 complete sentences. Use the rubric here to help you craft your response, focusing on sentence structure and content.